Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer issued a stinging rebuke of Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu this week, calling him an obstacle to peace.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his way by allowing his political survival to take the precedence over the best interests of Israel.
And House Speaker Mike Johnson insists he's still looking for a way to pass aid to Ukraine, even if it risks angering his far-right members. Notable moves from both party leaders that could have far-reaching implications for U.S. allies and America's standing as a global power. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Zolan Kano-Youngs, a White House correspondent for The New York Times. Scott McFarlane is a congressional correspondent for CBS News. Todd Zwillich is with 1A of NPR. And Jim Sciutto is an anchor and the chief national security analyst at CNN. He's also the author of The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. Thank you all for being here tonight. Jim, I want to start with you with Senator Schumer's blunt critique of Prime Minister Netanyahu. He blamed Netanyahu's actions for pushing support for Israel to the lowest that they've been historically. How significant is this shift, and will it actually result in any policy change?
First of all, it's hard to imagine the senior Democrat in the Senate did not do this in conjunction with the White House. And Schumer gives the Biden administration a way to communicate in even starker terms its clear upset with the progress of the war in Gaza, the lack of sufficient humanitarian aid, etc. This is a very public break, arguably the most public break in decades, at least, between U.S. and Israeli leadership at a critical time when Israel is at war. The irony is that despite even deep divisions in the Israeli public and frankly, deep skepticism of Netanyahu, I mean, if you held the vote today, he would almost certainly lose. Getting this kind of criticism from the outside, even from Israel's closest ally, to some degree, galvanizes his support or gives him a little bit of a lease on life because they don't like to hear that sort of criticism from outside the country while they're at war.
I mean, Zolan, it's no secret that President Biden is clearly frustrated with Netanyahu. Vice President Harris recently met with Netanyahu's top political rival, Benny Gantz. And today, President Biden said this in response to Schumer's speech.
I'm not going to elaborate on the speech. He made a good speech, and I think he expressed a serious concern shared not only by him, but by many Americans.
Zolan, is Schumer essentially saying what Biden won't in public?
Well, sometimes I was just about to say what you don't say is just as important as what you do say, and there you don't see the president condemning Schumer's statements, criticizing it at all. That does say a lot. Look, the president and the White House, their public statements, they know have to be, they're very sensitive about their public statements because you still have ongoing negotiations when it comes to a hostage release and a temporary ceasefire, and they don't want to do anything to take away from that. That being said, we do know that as these comments are made, we have seen tensions increasingly raising when it comes to private calls with President Biden and that of Netanyahu. That goes towards Netanyahu not fully backing a potential two-state solution, not doing enough in the White House's view to lower a civilian death toll that's now at 30,000, as well as what we've seen recently with a potential military campaign in Rafah, where we know that many of the displaced Palestinians are, at this point, staying. So tensions are definitely rising, and as these statements are made, it's reflective of an overall tense relationship.
I also think you can't discount the importance of domestic consumption here.
Oh, absolutely.
Of course, Israelis don't want to hear it from Americans. Republicans hate the statement. Joe Biden has a massive rift and a big problem on his progressive left. He's been looking all along for ways to show that he's not 100% full bore behind Netanyahu, even though practically he has been because of his support for Israel. And the importance, I think, much more than sending a message to the Israelis, which they can do through private channels, is domestic political consumption to Democrats and the Democratic base to say, we hear you, we're not with this guy. Yes, we support Israel, but Netanyahu's not our guy.
Yeah.
You know that's going to matter in Michigan as well.
It is.
We've seen that with the number of administration officials that have been deployed to Michigan to talk to pro-Palestine advocates.
In a number of those key swing states with Arab and Muslim voters as well as young voters. Scott, another U.S. ally that Ukraine has been in urgent need of ammunition, of aid. Speaker Johnson says that he intends to bring a bill to the floor with Ukraine aid. What are the chances that that actually reaches the president's desk anytime soon?
Ukraine aid, that was a job the White House wanted done in 2023. Yeah. Here we are in mid-March, and it's still not done. The Speaker's office has said, told us today, in fact, that they're going to have to wait till government spending and funding is buttoned up next week before they can move on to foreign aid in Ukraine. So there's another week that's going to burn by before next Friday's deadline. And they're going to have to pass it with Democratic votes, too, which is such a novel thing that Congress is functioning now, needing the minority to provide all the requisite votes for all the vital things. There are these two discharge petitions, that end run they run to circumvent leadership and force something onto the floor. Those are sluggish right now. They're not going to move in the next few days. It's going to take time. And time is burning. And I think for some Americans, no matter what they think of TikTok, they got that bill from the floor to passage in 8 days. Yeah. And Ukraine money is sitting there month after month.
And Ukrainian forces are suffering. They are running out of ammunition. They're already being outfired, outshelled by Russian forces there. And I've been told by Ukrainian commanders that I keep in touch with, who are on the ground there, that they are losing lives, that this is costing Ukrainian lives to have U.S. aid stalled.
I think it's so important to remind folks that when we report on the daily sort of updates of congressional negotiations, there are lives at stake. I spent time recently with a Ukrainian family that's currently on parole, temporary refugee status, for lack of a better word, and they said that their relatives in Ukraine are calling them each morning to ask specifically about whether or not the U.S. will pass aid and whether or not they're closer. And it seems we are no closer at this point.
I mean, Todd, when the Senate passed Ukraine aid in May of 2022, only 11 Republicans opposed it. But a vote earlier this year, more than 24 Republicans opposed it. What's changed?
The House Republican Conference is MAGA land. The Congress is in this situation not because of Congress writ large, but because of Republicans. Republicans are in this situation because Donald Trump is against this aid. He relied on Viktor Orban, authoritarian leader of Hungary, this week to filter his message to the world that he is not going to spend a penny on Ukraine if he's reelected. And I think it's important to look at this holistically. We don't have time to go down the entire history of Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, but started in 2016, if you like, when he looked into the camera and asked Russia to interfere in the election on his behalf. They did. 2018, he went in front of the world in Helsinki and sided with Vladimir Putin instead of his own intelligence services. Russia interfered in 2020. Trump campaign officials, in fact, a campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, gave private polling information to a Ukrainian-Russian agent named Konstantin Kalimnik. That is in the Senate Intelligence Report. I recount all this to give you the holistic vision of somebody who's running for president who has completely divided his party because he has upended decades and decades of pro-NATO, pro-Western, anti-Putin statements.
And it's not secret. I mean, he's made public statements praising Vladimir Putin as a strong leader. And I spoke to several of Trump's former senior advisors for the book, and they told me that in the second Trump term, Ukraine aid is done. It's finished. And that's just one piece of a larger reversal in U.S.
Yeah, and
policy.
I do want to get to the stakes and what those former officials told you. But first, Jim, in your new book, which is out this week, which I have right here.
Thank you.
You issue a warning. You say that we're in this post-Cold War global order and that the U.S. is in a 1939 moment. Why do you say that?
So I'd been reporting on the deteriorating relationship between the U.S. and Russia for a number of years, written about it, and Russia and our European partners. But when I was in Ukraine in February 2022, when the tanks started rolling across the border and the cruise missiles started falling on Ukrainian cities, it struck me that this was a clean break. Putin had already taken small pieces of Europe before, a piece of Georgia, 2 pieces of Ukraine in 2014, but he was attempting to absorb the largest country in Europe by force of arms. And he had been telegraphing this for some time. It didn't happen as quickly as he wanted, but he's still at it and has killed tens of thousands of people, including many civilians in that process. And that, to me, and I traveled around the world for this book, from Western Europe to Eastern Europe to Asia, and to others that I spoke with, is a challenge not just to the U.S., but to the system we and our allies and much of the world has relied on for 80 years since World War II. A general respect for the sovereignty of borders, open trade lanes, etc. He's challenging that, and there's a parallel to 1939 in that we had a leader like that in 1939, went by the name of Adolf Hitler, who attempted the same thing. And you had many of the same, you had appeasers at the time as well who said, well, if you give them a little piece, it'll be fine. But I think Churchill's quote about an appeaser as someone who feeds the crocodile and hopes that he will be its last meal applies here. When I ask world leaders that same question, is this a 1939 moment, they put it in similar terms.
And the domestic political calendar isn't just November, though. I mean, we're in the heart now of congressional primary season, where your only threat in some of these Republican districts is a threat to your right, somebody to outflank you on the Trump side. These are the people the speaker will have to go to try to get votes for Ukraine aid right now. I think this gets more perilous the further we get into 2024 because of those primaries.
And you think that it could very well go beyond the election? Ukraine, that it may not pass before then?
The Congress is going to become more paralyzed as the year moves on, as if it wasn't paralyzed enough already. And I think the calendar works against this in every possible way.
There was some hope as well in the White House, maybe around November, December, when the trade-off, when it was looking like it would be Ukraine aid, as well as money for the South China Sea, as well as for Israel, for border restrictions. I talked to White House officials who were a little optimistic. Just maybe this month, I've been asking those same questions, and I get no articulation of a clear path forward for Ukraine aid.
I mean, how are they feeling inside the White House about the prospect?
Not good. Not good at this point. They did move forward and thought that they actually proposed immigration restrictions that I know that Trump administration officials were telling me when President Trump was in office that they wanted, they were calling for, raising credible fear, making it harder for asylum seekers. They thought that they gave Republicans an olive branch with that. But when politics, took over with that deal, they're not feeling good about the prospects for Ukraine aid.
We should be clear on Capitol Hill, too. It is 100% true that Speaker Johnson is searching for the votes. He's going to have to use a lot of Democrats. It's usually a death knell for a speaker on a high-profile vote. But it's more than that. Donald Trump's viceroys on Capitol Hill, Marjorie Taylor Greene, are directly threatening him. She said, it might have been 10 days ago, if this aid passes in any form, discharge petition, funny procedures that get around the speaker, any form, Mike Johnson, we will do to you what we did to Kevin McCarthy. That means you're done. That's the threat. And so it's not just, used to be with old speakers, passing big bills with lots of the other party was really, really dangerous. It didn't make you a good general. Now it's that times 10. Now it's, if this passes, you join the ranks of other Republican speakers who've been out.
Especially if it passes with Democratic votes, which he said he may very well have to try it with that. But Jim, you also spoke to multiple former Trump officials for your book, including retired Marine General John Kelly, who was also former chief of staff to then President Trump. And Kelly told you that a second term with him, speaking about Trump, particularly when he would not be worrying about re-election, it would be fundamentally a catastrophe for us. What are the stakes of a second Trump term?
Think of this. He served 40 years as a Marine general. He's a Gold Star father. This is a serious man who loves his country. And by the way, largely a lifelong Republican, saying Trump is unfit for office, fundamentally a catastrophe. That's a remarkable appraisal to hear from a former chief of staff to a former U.S. president. John Bolton told me, and again, I'm quoting from him directly here, that Trump doesn't have enough of a brain, his words, to articulate a China policy. You couple that with former Vice President Pence saying today he cannot in good conscience endorse him. These are people who worked with him for 4 years, advised him at the highest levels, were in the room with him as he was making consequential decisions about this country, and they judged that decision-making and his priorities to be fundamentally problematic for this country. It's remarkable, and I don't think there's any precedent for that. So when, those appraisals are not coming from journalists, they're not coming from folks on the left or the Democratic Party or rhinos or whatever. They're coming from folks who served in the Trump administration, and we should take pause. We should take pause. John Kelly, by the way, also described to me multiple instances where Trump expressed praise for Adolf Hitler, which is just a remarkable thing to be discussing in the 21st century.
Right, praised Adolf Hitler, praised a number of other dictators.
Putin, Kim, Xi Jinping, you name it.